Okay, Will, do you have, off the top of your head, the rough split of who watches this podcast versus who listens to it? Like what percentage watch on YouTube versus listen?
Oh, more on YouTube, and that's the case with podcasts all around. So let's say, for the purposes of this discussion, let's say it's like 70-30 on YouTube.
This is the opposite news I was hoping to hear, because I just got back from a dental procedure and my face and smile looks kind of crazy. And I was hoping that I could hide behind the veil of audio. I thought that it was more on downloads, but well, we'll make do. This is why I look like this or sound like this if I sound different. And you're watching this. Disappointing news. I will schedule my life better next time.
Yeah, be careful now that you know that. Now that you know that people are watching you and how you look.
And I'm even more self-conscious. That's all right, though. I know how many people watch the YouTube videos, and it's not enough for me to feel bad about how I look. So we just got to not get famous.
I'll say something here to take the pressure off of you. I haven't actually done this for either of our 2026 episodes yet, but I kept this running for most of our 2025 ones, and I've done this on other shows where I've been on video recently, which is I have a doc where I have each show listed per episode what I wore, and for a while I was trying not to repeat.
I'm certain that the shirt I'm wearing right now is a repeat. And I think about it every time before we record as I get dressed. I'm like, did I wear this? I'm just trying to not go 2 in a row. Not repeat. Just purely, did I wear this last time? Are they going to think we just did back-to-backs?
But I'm telling you that I have stopped caring in 2026.
Good. I feel like it's the least you can do for yourself in this year of years.
Absolutely.
Have a uniform.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to do it every time now. We'll see how many I can keep it going in a row.
Yes. I watched a YouTube video recently that I guess was recorded at a conference in December of Cory Doctorow, who coined your favorite word, enshittification.
Enshittification, yeah.
I believe coined, if not certainly popularized, and has a book titled it or with it in the title. He's talked about it a lot. He was certainly one who popularized the idea of platforms starting having to provide value to their consumers and then shifting to extracting value from their consumers, this process called enshittification, which we have talked about a bunch, about why that's maybe, in your opinion, kind of a dumb term when that's just capitalism. It's always going to work like that. And it doesn't just apply to software platforms, although maybe it's most pronounced there where the value feels outsized at the beginning and the extraction feels outsized at the end. Whereas in a retail environment, you don't feel quite the pinch that you do when you're on a software platform that you spend every day.
Yeah, I'll just get it out of the way and to sum it up now that we've thought about this a couple times, I could sum it up quickly and then let you continue with the exposition here. I just don't think enshittification ever has been a business practice. I think it's a way that you can look back and kind of describe how people react to the changing relationships that they have with the platforms based on the incentives of the platforms to keep growing. I don't think enshittification is like a deliberately cultivated business practice, and I don't think it's an intent of any of the companies. But, there's a lot of externalities that companies produce just by going about things and having forces act on them. I don't even know if Cory Doctorow claims that enshittification is an intentional business practice. He probably doesn't. But yeah, that was my personal reaction to it. Was I was just kind of thinking about it from that level, like that nobody is trying to enshittify anything. That's one of the characteristics of it. Yeah,
I think reading him a little more on this, he kind of holds the same position that enshittification is just a descriptor of this very natural process that with the incentives in play, that this just kind of must happen. No business is sitting down going how can we enshittify to maximize our profits? They're always looking to maximize profits. In software, that happens again by getting a bunch of users by making a very good free thing and then slowly making it either cost money or making it worse so that you can take money from your consumers of the product. So yeah, I think we're all on the same page there with that. Cory lectured at this conference and presented a lecture titled his case for a post-American enshittification resistant internet. And that really grabbed me. Just as a title, I was like, if this guy's talking about it, I'm interested to hear what he has to say, because post-American these days sounding pretty nice, and enshittification resistant, that would be nice also if there was ways of either subverting those incentives or that pattern.
And it's in Germany, his talk, right?
It is, and I don't have the name of the conference in front of me here, but it's kind of a tech conference. Cory is an advocate or works with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a foundation that does a lot of work in open source software. A term that comes up a few times in this lecture and that they advocate for is like general purpose computing, right? Which is this sense that like computing should be like open for people to do what they want with their computers. It should be accessible. That's part of the ethos of open source. And for our maybe non-tech listeners, open source refers to software that is the code is open so people can look at it and contribute to it. Most open source code in this term is actually free and open source. Free meaning anyone can contribute to it. There's open source code that's just open so people could look. I think Twitter right now or x.com is open source. You can look at the Twitter's code and see how it works, but you can't like propose changes to how Twitter works. They own that code, and it's not free and open source.
And what's the word for the opposite of open source or free?
Closed source, proprietary. I don't know what is
proprietary was
proprietary.
What I was thinking. Yeah, that's kind of a useful word too.
Yeah, proprietary. Closed source does get tossed around. I think partially because some open source projects go closed source eventually. There's security reasons to do that, right? Not all platforms should be wide open to have hackers and security researchers understanding every little thing that could be wrong. But I think the argument for open source, slight tangent, is similar to like the argument for Wikipedia, right? That on net, if things are open and all in public, that even if there's issues, those get fixed faster when the whole internet is looking at it and proposing fixes, and like you can kind of iterate this way. There are arguments to the contrary that you could make, and certainly maybe the Wikipedia example brings the counter arguments already, right? Wikipedia is not a perfect platform for information.
Like that it's overrun by leftist ideology.
Yeah, yeah. We need kind of a Grokpedia kind of situation, right? Where we need a right wing Wikipedia. So definitely open source, famously leftist.
Because that's what you do to solve that problem, right? Is you go off and you create your own alternatively polarized version of it. That solves everything.
Which again, in open source is an option. You can, right? Like with, x.com being open source, someone could look at the source code and just go like, all right, I'm gonna make my own thing. There's IP law, which we'll maybe get into, which prevents that for x.com's case. But many software projects in the open source world, you can what's called fork the project, where you take the code and just like you're forking on a tree branch, take it a different direction, where you've got all the original code and you've just made some adjustments to make it your own. And maybe a bunch of users like the changes you made and they're going to join your fork. So that's kind of Cory's background in this. Cory's also a writer, blogger, like one of the very most famous kind of early blogger guys. He's an author of several books. And I think it's relevant that he also comes from this like hacker culture. And I think sometimes when we hear the word hacker, we think of like a guy in a black hoodie causing problems on the internet, right? Like hacking into government databases or causing trouble for businesses.
Like a scam or theft or something.
Yeah, a scam or theft or explicitly criminal behavior meant to like be destructive. I think if you were to ask Cory or the other people in this space, they think of hacking in the more general original term, which is kind of subverting technology and software's intended use or expanding a piece of software's intended use. And so that can mean literally hacking the software to do something it wasn't supposed to do. It could mean things like reverse engineering, where you figure out how a piece of software works and build a better one yourself or make some changes yourself. There's also hardware hacking that, is modifying computers, electronics in ways that maybe the manufacturer would not intend. So that's when we say hacking in this conversation, that's what we mean, rather than like breaking into company systems to steal information and data.
A word that gamers use that can speak more directly to this intention and is less broad than hacking is modding. It's an understood term in gaming.
Totally. Yes. Modding is a great word for that. And that is more, I think, along the lines of where Cory's thinking in here. Although when we get into it, there is some actual like capital H hacking he's discussing as well. Or certainly from the perspective of the companies he's talking about when he's saying the post-American enshittification resistant internet.
Because modding is something that you can only do if something is open source or free to some extent. Sure. Because if something is totally proprietary and closed off, you can't mod it, you can't hack it unless you break the law, and then maybe you can obtain the capabilities to do so. But basically, open source means that you can mod it without breaking the law.
Yeah. And in the gaming world, that means usually many video game companies will kind of have a modding framework available or some like built-in kind of capabilities, that things that you could change that are even maybe within, like they can set some boundaries of what's moddable and what's not, right? There's some kind of almost fair use style guidelines there.
I'll throw one quick signpost to music and then I'll let you get into this, which is, I don't know if you remember this, but in 2017, I took some rough mixes of some music that you and me and two of our friends recorded that was from my first album session. I uploaded it to Free Music Archive. And in the years since, I don't know how evenly distributed it's been, that music has been downloaded with the Creative Commons license, which means that they can even use it commercially without having to pay for it, because it's called Free Music Archive. This is a website that aims to build a database of music that people can use for free for the various purposes without having to go negotiate a license and pay rights holders. Our 4 or 5 tracks that we put up there have been downloaded from Free Music Archive, I believe 50,000 times.
Wow.
Or more in that time, and there's probably a lot of music on that website that's been downloaded a lot, and so who knows, and there's all kinds of random YouTube videos that this music has ended up in because of that. So that's awesome. A kind of a funny example of how open source in music via like permissive license for using the music can lead to it spreading and ending up in cool places. Every once in a while I still get people reaching out to me to confirm, to tell me that they want to use it in like an indie game or an indie movie or something like that.
I remember we got one of the songs is in a Joel Haver YouTube video, and that was early Joel Haver. He's now very famous. He's like a very famous YouTuber that went on to like do films and it was like won Webbies and stuff. But yeah, one of our, I think Lutan is in a Joel Haver video. Yes, that will become relevant. So the talk that Doctorow lays out is, he makes a pretty interesting argument, which is, in this world that we're talking about, we know where platforms cause problems, right? I think on Upsample, we talk a lot about the ways that the platform economy, streaming services, the monopolies that are held by these big tech companies, these issues feel really sort of intractable. I often end our talks feeling a little bit like, well, what are you going to do? Because, these companies, Google, Meta, Spotify is an interesting example because it's a Swedish company, not an American company, but Apple, etc. They won, right? They have what are effectively monopolies, or these kind of like almost oligopoly style, permissions over U.S. law, and there's not much you can do, right? The FTC is not going to break up these companies. Kind of game over. This is the world we're stuck in on the internet for sure. And so Cory's outlining how first this came to be, which I didn't know. I had to learn a little bit about this. And most of it has to do with what is called anti-circumvention law. Had you heard, I'm sure you were familiar with anti-circumvention law somewhat, but had you heard about these laws before?
I don't ever remember knowing that term, but this is about the idea that you're not allowed to mess with like rights managed content, right? This is a proprietary enforcement law.
Yes. And it covers both like intellectual property, but also anti-circumvention law is like the reason it's illegal and, not prosecuted criminally, but it's illegal to like modify your MacBook Pro, like to bust it open and like do your own repairs on it. Apple, that's like forbidden by Apple's terms of use. And many, many software companies benefit from these, because anti-circumvention law also covers things like software piracy or reverse engineering, sort of like you couldn't, even if with Twitter's source code being open, you couldn't make another Twitter without getting like sued out the wazoo and, no matter what country you live in, being heavily penalized for breaking that law. And so the state of affairs in the internet is partially thanks to these anti-circumvention laws, which came about in the US naturally, right? Because a strong American tech companies mean a strong US economy, and so they make sense internally in the United States, right? Like that's pretty straightforward. I can see how those laws came into effect, especially with all the lobbyists that these huge tech companies have, right? Apple can just go to the Senate or Congress or whomever and say, hey, we would really prefer it if people were not allowed to like perpetually upgrade the batteries in their MacBook Pro. And this also helps Apple not get sued by advocacy groups who would say like right to repair laws, right? These two things are kind of at odds with each other. That there's these anti-circumvention laws saying you cannot mess with your John Deere tractor. John Deere is one of the biggest sort of scapegoats. Not scapegoats. John Deere is really a problem in this space because farmers have to like send their engines to be repaired by a John Deere repairman when they could just be fixed by a farmer who knows how to work on an engine. So there's anti-circumvention on one side, and then there's right to repair advocacy, which is saying when you buy a piece of technology, and I think some would extend it to pieces of software, if you're using, purchased a piece of software, not just subscribe to it, you should be able to like tinker with it, find out how it works, make changes if you want to. And anti-circumvention law gets around all that. Does that kind of like ring a bell, align with your understanding of how these laws work?
Yeah, and then at the worst side of it, you get the proprietary tractor. Like, whereas you used to just be able to fix stuff, now there are licenses, and supposedly you could be arrested if you try and fix something the wrong way, or the way that the company who owns the IP doesn't want you to try and fix it.
I mean, at the very, very worst end of it, one of the examples that Cory gives is a company that made ventilators during COVID, when ventilators were in very short supply, people were dying in hospitals. There was basically the thing separating, I guess, a ventilator from one other piece of medical equipment made by the same company was software. It was like, you just need to flip a few things in the software for this machine, and it became a fairly functional ventilator that could be used in a hospital. And this company just refused to do it. Just was like, sorry, can't. And I'm sure there was some, compliance or legal liability reason that they could point to say like, we won't do this because of this. But really it comes down to, if you were working at one of those hospitals and took it upon yourself to figure out how the software worked, hack the piece of hardware and, make a working ventilator, you would be legally responsible. Like, you'd be breaking the law there. And so there's, great examples of how this is not ideal stuff. There's also the example of like, I think you said it's like Mercedes-Benz who will like upcharge you to get the full accelerator. They'll put a software governor in your Mercedes, and they like upcharge you a subscription fee to get the full engine power. Like
Isn't Tesla doing this as well? I think I've heard a lot about that.
Right. Which again, I think to anyone, especially like someone like yourself, maybe who's like a free market person, this seems kind of crazy, right? Like, I think no one loves that this stuff happens except for these companies who, again, these are just ways to juice their profits. So we have all these anti-circumvention laws in the US, which again, makes sense in the US. But in 2026, they are not in the US, they're everywhere. Canada has them, Latin America, the EU, basically any country now has some form of these anti-circumvention laws preventing modification of hardware, software, by threat of criminal punishment. And Cory goes into well, how did this happen? And take a wild guess, it's trade deals with the US. I think one of the examples he gave was a Latin American country that was negotiating kind of a trade deal with the US, and the US said, hey, we want you to, enforce an anti-circumvention law in your country, or we're not going to trade with you. And this, fairly poor country was like, we can't do this because our farmers use these John Deere tractors or all sorts of stuff that they get from the US. And it's just, we cannot force our countrymen to pay John Deere all this for, these people can fix their own tractors. And the US was like, okay, we're going to stop buying coffee from you, which would have just decimated that country's economy. And so they went for it.
So it was a political football for the U.S. And they wanted to get the concession out of other countries to have anti-circumvention laws, because that would then allow U.S. multinational companies, not just tech companies, but in the case that we're going to talk about, especially tech companies, to be able to go out and exploit other markets in the same way that they already could in the US, because they would be allowed to do more proprietary shenanigans and extract more value out of having their locked down IP and systems, right?
Right, yeah. And I mean, you can see why the US wanted to do this, or at least the lobbyists who were, driving these decisions. If you can buy a MacBook Pro in, New York and then drive to Toronto and have someone in Toronto crack it open, replace the motherboard with something more powerful or cheaper or whatever, and then drive back to the United States, then the value of those motherboards, when Apple charges $900 to fix them, that just goes down because maybe there's a Canadian who will do it for $500.
And that would be good for the consumer, but it's not good for Apple. And so Apple has lobbied the US government to help enforce the system. Yeah,
totally. And so that's how we get these anti-circumvention laws that are in the US's best interest, or certainly American tech companies' best interests, and directly against the interest of the countries that are, have these in place. And so to go back to this coffee example and every other example of this, really these anti-circumvention laws were forced on these countries under threat of tariffs, right? That's basically the coffee example, is we're going to just tariff the coffee so we, companies won't buy it anymore and you're going to be screwed. And well, we have tariffs now. Many of these countries are, subject to really heavy tariffs. I think Canada's got threatened again with another 100% tariff if we continue this China trade deal.
But nobody knows exactly how much the tariffs are on anybody at any given time.
Right. And, the example Cory gives is it's like someone threatening, you better not do something I don't want you to do, or I'm going to burn your house down. And then they just burn your house down anyway. The threat, the behavior they were trying to block you from, your incentive is gone, right? If everyone is complying with these anti-circumvention laws or keeping these enforced to keep the US happy and keep trade flowing freely and no tariffs, well, there are tariffs and trade is not flowing freely, and the US is being insane and isolationist. So the reason for Canada or Ecuador or the EU to keep these anti-circumvention laws enforced has just evaporated, which, opens up some interesting possibilities.
Yeah, it doesn't it doesn't have to be that way for all time just because it was devised that way for U.S. political reasons. And that's what he gets into, right? Like he's talking about, we don't have to necessarily keep doing it this way. And if it was used as, not used as a cudgel, but like if it was their objective, the U.S.'s objective in negotiations to make something happen, then if we want something to be different, then we can start with this and try and threaten to not allow this anymore and open it up, or we can just go ahead and open it up, and then you know we're kind of in a trade war at that point, but that this is, you know, you could justify it as a trade war based on what's going on. Yeah.
So his thing is like, if these anti-circumvention laws are certainly not serving the countries that are enforcing them, then what is stopping that example that I just gave, where, you know, maybe there's a electronics company that starts making MacBook compatible logic boards, motherboards in Canada, and selling them to American consumers who drive over the border, or selling them to Canadian consumers who live here at, you know, a $300 discount from the Apple repair price. I want to be a little bit careful about how I phrase some of these examples on YouTube here. But truly, like, what's stopping that? And think of the enormous, like, entrepreneurial potential here. He gives this example of, like, also what's stopping someone in Finland from starting a company that develops a secure and safe jailbreak for iPhones and sells that to users, you know, for $30 a pop. And, you know, right now, the only thing stopping that is the U.S. would be mad, but the U.S. is, again, already mad. There's already tariffs.
U.S. is already mad at everybody.
Yeah. And vice versa, right? Like, that we've just sort of, Trump has inadvertently opened the floodgates for this type of thing to happen by enforcing these tariffs that completely, Cory argues, completely kind of negate any downside for, or sorry, the downside is already in place. So it's like, well, what do we have to lose? And so he's proposing this, like, this post-American internet that he's talking about is this, where really you could do things, like jailbreaking iPhones and selling jailbreaks, and then you can, like, price software however you want, or make your own, you know, EU app store and have the EU collect commissions on the App Store instead of Apple taking 30%. Or Canada can do a similar thing, right? They can develop its own phones. You could, you know, like, reverse engineer and clone iOS and make Canadian iPhones, which I understand some of these examples to some listeners are going to feel ethically a bit dicey, right? Like, it's hard to, you know, to say, like, well, poor Apple, like, let's think about the little guy here. But, you know, I understand that there will be a line that certain companies, certain businesses might want to draw, or certain countries might want to draw, as far as, like, maybe Canada does not want to be the country to create, like, the fake iPhone that's the exact same source code, if they've managed to reverse engineer it or come by it, you know, ill-gottenly.
Another example of something that's happening that is sort of around this topic. It's not just about anti-circumvention and tech, but it's about trade, where here in Canada, we have the promise of there being Chinese cars available for sale in Canada in the near future in slightly greater numbers, nothing crazy yet. And you do have the U.S. getting mad at that because of its impact on sales of Tesla or any U.S. automaker, I guess, because the Chinese cars haven't been big time players in the Canadian market yet, but there's the potential to open up the Canadian market to more Chinese cars just for affordability reasons, just because they could be the cheapest product on the market if it was a free market. So the U.S. may not like that because it means their more expensive products might not be as attractive to Canadian consumers anymore, or especially if they're charging subscriptions to continue using basic features of the car. I mean, who's not saying that Chinese cars, they could do that too, but yeah, this trade issue is playing out in automobiles in Canada too now.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's a great example. The Tesla, you know, putting a governor on your gas pedal is a great example of how this post-American internet, which now I'll kind of use as a shorthand for, like, basically a piracy and, IP duplication free-for-all, potentially, how that solves the enshittification problem, right? Where Tesla has enshittified, in Cory's terms, their cars. They want you to pay a subscription to access the full speed of your Tesla. Well, we don't and China will happily sell us cars that work fine. Great. That's, problem solved. We're sick of Meta's algorithm, but, that happens to be the platform that works the best. Someone can clone it. Someone can make a better one that, competes more directly with it, without worrying about getting sued. Well, they can worry about getting sued, but the countries don't have to enforce these laws, right? You can just, courts in Canada, if someone made Canadian Meta and a nice Instagram app that looked kind of identical and Meta got mad, Canadian courts don't have to enforce those laws. And so, you can say, I don't have how Meta works. Great. You use some alternative, right? And I could easily see this expanding to music streaming, although it does get, I think, a little bit dicey. We have an example here, but before we get into the music side, do you have any major counterpoints you want to touch on with this whole vision of the post-American internet?
Well, my first major counterpoint is just that Cory Doctorow utters the completely ridiculous phrase, "We need to move fast and break kings." It's just, I lost it when I heard him say that. That's my first counterpoint.
Cory has a few what I've considered Cory-isms in this speech. I think he's right about this thing. I think he is a bit, how do I say this? He's a bit just tech Gen X cringe a little bit. But I admire his enthusiasm.
There's a place in the world for that. That's for sure.
Sure.
Well, here's an area where it could get really ugly, say the battle lines get drawn a little bit, if you think of EU versus US. Mm-hmm. So if the EU no longer wants to have an anti-circumvention law and you're able to start hacking US products, say that, Google and Microsoft and whoever, Google and Microsoft no longer allow any EU-based companies to use Google Cloud or Azure or AWS or whatever. There could be some disastrous kind of moves that some of these enormous, the Magnificent Seven companies could pull on any countries that decide to do this thing. So they are kind of they hold the key cards, I guess, and it is kind of scary how integrated they are with the U.S. government in that sense for us non-Americans, because any kind of retaliation that we do against them in this respect, they could wield all these, they could remove all these things that we kind of use as utilities because they've been these companies' loss leaders, and we have learned to use them all, right from how we are recording right now to, very extensive data warehouses that all kinds of companies use and all kinds of deployments of websites. Their tremendous size would really get to show it off if this really started to go.
Yeah, I think the Cory's assertion that now that the threat of tariffs has not passed, but it's realized, right? We already have the punishment, so what's stopping us is the U.S. won't necessarily just stop at tariffs, right? We've seen how they've been acting on the global political stage, and to say that they'll just go oh shoot, that was our one thing to pull, when other countries are quote unquote misbehaving in these trade wars. I think it's a bit naive to say that's the only thing up the US's sleeve as far as foreign policy goes. And this problem of if we're starting to do this, that countries have to be ready to be to just cut it all, right? So we would need Canadian data centers that are not, not from Amazon, not Google Cloud. We would need some other thing, right? So this would take years of infrastructure building and preparation. But I still take the hopeful sign that I think there's adequate will from the rest of the global community that if it's not Canada, if Canada doesn't have the resources to build it, that like maybe Germany can. Germany will start building data centers, and, Canadian companies or other companies in the EU can start using those. And yeah, maybe Canada can start getting data centers in Mexico. Just because like physical proximity actually does matter for cloud stuff. So I think there's adequate will from the non-US world to figure out how we can rely on them a lot less, right? I think that's a conversation Canada was having last year throughout all this tariff discussion, this like buy Canadian push that, should expand to like, doesn't have to be Canadian. There's a whole world out there of developed countries that can support this.
And it seems I want even less and less to stand up the thing of, if you imagine the Americans retreating, that what you end up is Chinese domination of more places, because it's less and less obvious that the US is a more credible long-term hegemon than China would be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it will be interesting to see how, if, this Canada-China trade deal like goes through and all the electric cars and stuff, to see how that happens. Obviously, China is like no prince as far as like ethics and how they handle their business as well, right? There's potential downsides there. But I think if the whole kind of global community is aligned on this, that there's like budgets and solutions for this. And, Cory kind of outlines that like the US will continue to become a less reliable supplier, or just a bad supplier, right? Because right now they're just like overcharging. They are, able to like push countries around with lobbying and these kind of threats around how they'll react. And the American consumer, because the other argument you could make, right, is, Germany needs to export Mercedes vehicles to the US. But the US is becoming, as it's falling apart a little bit, both economically and politically, the US is becoming less and less of a reliable importer of foreign goods, right? There's going to be tariffs on many, many things. The luxury class can only buy so many things, and the people who aren't in the luxury class are losing their ability to become regular consumers, certainly of Mercedes-Benz vehicles, but, all sorts of things, right? Like the dependence on the US as an importer of your country's goods is like not a great thing.
Yeah, this is going to be a different world. This move of dumping anti-circumvention laws would be an interesting part of this new world, but definitely wouldn't just lead to a forking and a recreation of the way things look like now. It would have to be very different. It would not have the scope of a lot of the big tech world that we as consumers consume and inhabit today. It would probably be a lot smaller, and it would be a lot different.
Yeah, which I take to be, a positive thing. We've talked a little bit about some of the issues with, to move it to music a little bit, just the sheer size of these platforms, right? Then we've talked about these like alternatives being just like, think smaller. You don't need all the music everywhere. Although this now kind of, I think, brings us to kind of a potential example, although this did happen, I think, stateside. Had you heard of Anna's Archive before this situation here?
I think I might have heard of them once, but I knew of them as like they would like digitize or archive books or something. Yep. Like that was kind of their main mission.
Yeah, Anna's Archive is one of kind of a small group of like internet archivist communities. There's like archive.org, right, which is an actual archive of sites on the internet. And these archiving sites do stand in the face of anti-circumvention, right? Archive.org can be used to like read a New York Times article if you don't have a subscription, because they've just archived the website. They're not going to archive it with the paywall. They've just added it to their archive and you can read it. Anna's Archive, also used for anti-circumvention and IP circumvention, in that it is a major place to get textbooks that maybe you don't want to pay hundreds of dollars for, right? In the North American university textbook scheme, that's a famous problem in in colleges and universities here. And so Anna's Archive, I think, was best known as like a place to get textbooks for free, which again, delicate ethics there. Textbook writers ought to be paid, but I know that they, in general, are not making proportional money to what the textbook publishers are charging. So Anna's Archive pulled off maybe the greatest digital heist, non-Bitcoin digital heist of our century, and has somehow scraped all of Spotify. By scraped, I mean web scraped. So, downloaded and compiled all of Spotify, and just has it in an enormous, enormous database. And what did you think when you first heard this information?
Well, when I first heard of it, I looked at their post about it where they talk about their timeline of releasing everything, and they talk a little bit about what they did. And I was like, well, I mean, it just seems like a bit of a strange implementation of an idea. Like, it's not an obvious thing to do necessarily, like, oh, my intention is to like preserve the archive of like as much of the music of the world as possible, so I'm going to download it at like lower quality than what I print spoken, like talking podcasts at in a massive archive. I mean, I guess that's the only way to do it, because otherwise, you're talking about such a huge lift and how big the file sizes would be. But I don't really get it. Like, I would think that something like this, you would kind of do it as a first kind of shot across the bow, and then you would probably be working on something else. I don't really know what else they would be working on. So my first reaction was that I just kind of thought it was strange, and that it was a bit of a strange and unexpected move from people who are primarily just concerned with like archiving and preservation. But then, as we're talking about it now, I'm realizing like, yeah, this is hacking in the sense that we were talking about earlier. Yeah. It's exactly that. It's trying to download a very proprietary thing. And now, like, in theory, it could be modded or preserved. Like, if you had enough file space, and they haven't released all the audio, I don't think, to be torrented. They've only released the metadata so far. Yeah. But, if in theory, if you downloaded all the files, you could like run a local version of what Spotify was in December of 2025, which is pretty absurd to think about.
Totally. And I think this is why this kind of dovetails from what we were talking about, is in this post-American, post-shitified world, right? Because again, Spotify is not exactly an American company, although I think they must have some, they're traded on American stock exchanges and whatnot. So there's an Americanness to them. But they're certainly a symptom of the same problems. Like, Spotify is a symptom of the same problems we're discussing. And in this world where you might think about like, what would we do after Spotify? Like, everyone wants off. It'd be a better world if Spotify didn't exist or there was alternatives. I think this, like you said, it's a shot across the bow, and it's like a good V1, V0 proof of concept that I haven't looked into the technical details of it, but it's quite a feat to be able to scrape that. It's like 30 terabytes or something of data, or is it hundreds of terabytes of data?
Probably hundreds. I'm looking back at the post now. They say we archived around 86 million music files, representing around 99.6% of listens. It's a little under 300 terabytes 300 in total terabytes, size. And they're doing it for, they use popularity score, which is like a Spotify kind of internal piece of metadata. And for everything with a popularity score greater than 0, they use 160K OGG files. And then for popularity score of 0, they didn't take all the files. They took some, and they did it at some super, super low compressed audio quality, 75 kilobit OGG files. So they're working with like really kind of choppy MP3 sizes to be able to get it all and to not have it be absolutely massive. It's still over 300 terabytes. And they have it as of July of 2025. So releases after that are not in this archive.
So in the security space, like a proof of concept exploit means this could be probably achieved again. Spotify has probably since patched, however, Anna's Archive initially managed to pull this off. But if you can do it once, usually it's doable again. And so, yeah, you could imagine a world where I'm sure that the audio quality is not good enough to rival a Spotify or Apple Music. But again, one day in a sort of post-monopoly internet, that someone might host like a free and open source Spotify, or maybe that just does get to exist and it is just crappy quality. And like, if you're a 12-year-old in Brazil, you don't have to stream on YouTube and get your YouTube ads and whatever. That's, I think, most people in the second and third world's way of listening to music is through YouTube. That you can just use this kind of free streaming service, and the artists are going to get about the same amount of money from that as they are from Spotify, and that's, I think, still a better world. And you could also, if you were doing this post Spotify app, you could also set up royalty payouts properly, right? Like you could talk to the SOCANs and ASCAPs of the world. Maybe not, you couldn't have anything from the majors, but like you could do it the indie way and do kind of royalty payouts. Doesn't have to be pure piracy.
Do you know about the lawfare against Anna's Archive that has taken place in the month of January after this happened?
Nope.
So, according to Ars Technica, Spotify led a lawsuit with the backing of the majors to sue Anna's Archive in the US after this happened. And they managed to get one of the domains where Anna's Archive published its work taken offline, I believe, working with Cloudflare. However, they are using different domains. Like right now, when I went to go pull up the blog post where they announce what they did, it's at a .li. It's a Liechtenstein domain.
Yeah.
So they're still able to find other ways to stay up as a website. But Spotify won in court to try and get their website taken down. I am also seeing an article in Exclaim published today, the day that we're recording this, at least January 27th, where this article claims Spotify and major record labels Universal Music Group, Sony Entertainment, and Warner Music Group have filed a lawsuit against online shadow library search engine Anna's Archive, alleging that the platform scraped 86 million music files and claiming an unfathomable $13 trillion in damages.
13 trillion? That is very funny. Again, to go back to the original point, these lawsuits would go nowhere if these countries stopped anti-circumvention. I think the major labels obviously complicate things in the music world, where Canadians probably would like to continue listening to music from the major labels. But like, again, the major labels are, I don't think anyone's favorite. And so I don't feel terribly about, them losing a buck. Again, artists, this is I'm not advocating exactly for piracy. But, you could see the cracks beginning to appear, or these slight kind of glimmers of like what the future might look like if the US really does kind of isolate itself from the global world, both in terms of like IP law, copyright law, and how software runs.
Yeah, I found the court filing that was published by Music Business Worldwide, which I have not read, but I will provide as a link on this episode so that I can check it out later, because it'll probably come up with something else we talk about. But yeah, the legal status of this is to be determined. But you're absolutely right. Everything we just talked about over the past hour, it has to do with like how this stuff could be handled. And yeah, the music rights of it all, they are kind of international in scope. But really, this is about if someone is based outside of the US and they wanted to do something like this, how much protection do they have from the long arm of the US, right?
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think there's some nuance to what the ideal state is, right? I don't think a total free-for-all of intellectual property is the right thing. I think we ended up with Spotify partially because of music piracy, right? You could argue that like music piracy begat Spotify, where everyone expected everything was, all art was free for them. To say the same thing of Netflix or streaming services in general. And so I don't think that the positive case here is just a complete intellectual property free-for-all. I think it is that there's this possibility that some power is wrenched away from these major players who are not actually acting in the best interests of their artists. They're not acting in the best interests of like art in general. And certainly like the software that we use to consume this art leaves a lot to be desired as far as its effects on us.
Yeah, I don't know how many more updates we'll have on this or if there is a next move like I was wondering about the first time I saw it. But I mean, the music files will drop apparently at some point for people to be able to torrent. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, hopefully they can, like set something up in Sweden, kind of famously, maybe most famous for the Pirate Bay, is pretty loose on copyright law and piracy law. And so there are some places probably where they could host the data and the US would have a hard time shutting it down.
I also don't really think there's much danger to Spotify from this happening.
No.
Like that's the thing, is people are not going to stop using Spotify because they have the opportunity to torrent 300 terabytes of music and do that instead. Like this is no threat to the business model.
Wait, you don't think it's $30 trillion of damages? The numbers are right there. It's a huge threat. Spotify can't afford a $30 trillion. They can barely afford to pay royalties.
Yeah. No, there's no threat to the streaming business model from this because very few people, not even us, we are not even tempted to go and download and start running this. I don't think if it were available to us. No,
it's just kind of a neat example of the type of thing that would be doable on a post-American internet.
And that's a true example of the tenet that information wants to be free, is because the key thing here is not whether or not the information is free, because if these music files drop for torrenting, in theory it is free and it is out there.
Yeah.
The reason why people end up using streamers and subscribing to them and paying to use their proprietary services is because of all kinds of considerations and conveniences and form factors other than whether or not it is possible to obtain that somewhere else for free.
Yeah,
there's so much more to it, which I think is a feather in the cap of the people who want to undertake the cause of like going out and doing something like this and archiving stuff.
Yeah. Interesting times. So that is, I'd recommend people watch the lecture. I kind of have hand waved through a lot of it, so we'll probably link the YouTube video. Curious to hear anyone's thoughts on this, because I think it is, some of these ideas are like fairly radical. This is not just like mainstream non-American thinking. I think this is, it's interesting to hear Cory out and really think about what this could look like.
Yeah. Okay, I got a fun thing to go out on. You want to go out on this with Pitchfork?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, so Pitchfork last week, they published on their website a message that came on the occasion of 30 years since their founding.
Okay.
So it's about as old as we are, roughly speaking. Starting today, they say, there is a new Pitchfork subscription that costs $5 a month, which allows readers to score albums themselves, comment on our reviews, and be in dialogue with our critics and each other. They continue, the aggregate reader score will appear beneath Pitchfork's score on the review. We still believe in the authority and, to be honest, the primacy of Pitchfork's taste, but we want to publish our readers' taste and opinions too. The comments section will be moderated by our editors and adhere to our new community guidelines. Subscribers will also have access to Pitchfork's full review archive, which now contains over 30,000 reviews. For non-subscribers, the news, features, and column sections of the site will continue to be free, and casual readers can continue to read 4 free reviews per month. But to read unlimited reviews, see the reader scores, and comment yourself or read the comments of others, you'll have to smash subscribe.
Wow, smash like and subscribe.
Which is what you should do right now, by the way, if you're watching this.
Yeah. That is, I had seen some rumblings about this, and I think I saw first the announcement detached from this paywall aspect. I first saw the announcement that like Pitchfork's going to aggregate reader scores, which I thought was funny because like Pitchfork's whole thing was like this Condé Nast highbrow editorial voice, right? This is like they've got Bon Appetit as their food criticism, and they've got Pitchfork as their music criticism.
Or before Condé, in the 20 years before that, their own kind of snarky version of cultivating that taste and thinking they know better. Yeah.
Yeah, and like that very kind of hipster poptimist. I'm using hipster in like the 2010s term. I don't know what that word means anymore, but like, Pitchfork certainly had this like, the snobby hipster guy being like, oh, we heard about this first, or the first album was better, or whatever. And it's very funny to first open this up to readers and then immediately dunk by saying the primacy of Pitchfork's taste is so good because they can't even sell it. Like they can't even Wikipedia it by being like, you know what, we are going to arrive collectively at the aggregate, the correct score by letting everyone submit, and we'll come somewhere in the middle. And that'll be the right score. Instead, it's like, well, you guys actually are still dumb, and Pitchfork's taste is way better, but we'll let you comment if you pay $5 a month. And
but at the same time, like lots of people do this, like Metacritic, they have the reader's score and the critic score. Like it's nothing crazy.
No, yeah, it seems fine. It's interesting that they're paywalling the reader score, but I guess that's more newsworthy than the critic score, which is just like the headline.
They're paywalling the ability to contribute to the reader score.
But to read unlimited reviews, see the reader scores, and comment, you'll have to smash subscribe.
Oh.
So you can't even see the reader scores now until you're subscribed.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's more extensive than I thought. Yeah, you're right.
So it's interesting to paywall that, but I guess that is more newsworthy, or you could see someone checking a review and going like, I wonder what the readers thought of this, if Pitchfork either panned it. It's sort of like if Metacritic upcharged you to see the user score. Rotten Tomatoes only showed you the critic score and upcharged you to see the user score.
Huh. Yeah, which would be very strange. Okay, so here's more on that from my first person point of view as a proprietor of a subscription thing, a very small one on a very small scale. I have lots of people out here in our world who don't subscribe, and they'll say various things to me about it. They'll be like, oh, I've been meaning to subscribe for a long time, but I haven't, I'm sorry. Or they'll be like, oh, I've been thinking about doing it, and I know and it's like, no, it's fine. Like I'm not out here trying to hard sell all of those people, and I'm touched that they say things like that, whether or not they ever actually end up doing it. That's totally fine. It's part of my quest to have the door open and find the people who will actually subscribe and invite them in, and that is hard, and it's hard to retain them because there's also churn. But that's the quest that I'm on, doing something with a subscription. Now, I declined a common piece of advice that there often is out there in content creator world when you're going to think about doing a subscription product, which is I did not try and grow my free reach as much as possible before starting to do any paid content.
Okay.
I started them both at the same time functionally. I messed around with rhythm changes for about a year and a half anyways, but then when I started doing a free weekly by email, I also started doing paid subscriptions right then and there from zero. And there wasn't a big group of free signups who got an initial offer.
Right.
And the reason why I wanted to start doing it that way, well, there's a few reasons, but one of them was I wanted to just write more. I needed to get better at writing quickly because I was kind of starting from a low level of experience. But also, I never wanted to feel like I was gating anything that had previously been free.
Interesting.
I wanted to maintain the expectation that there was always something different that you could subscribe to and that it had been there alongside the free thing. And I think that's why, even on our small scale, I've always I've felt good vibes from the fact that I'm out here with a paid product, even if it has the typical smaller share of adoption than what I'm doing on the free content side, because I don't think I've ever pulled some content away from anybody that I was previously offering for free. And that is indeed what Pitchfork is doing here. I think that's what a lot of brands and companies do. And I think the ones that do that, they experience a worse reaction out there to launching a paywall than people who've maybe done a different way.
It is very interesting. And the 4 reviews per month is maybe a little stingy, but I mean, I read maybe 0, maybe 1 Pitchfork review per month. I think maybe Pitchfork is also overplaying their hand. Like, they are not, like Hearing Things is probably the actual, if you wanted a subscription newsletter, Hearing Things seems to have like better reviews and is better regarded. I think a lot of them are from Pitchfork. So if you wanted that, I don't know. I feel like Pitchfork is maybe thinking they've got a little more leverage here than they do.
Yeah, don't you just read it as like they actually are kind of jealous of Hearing Things and they would rather be them, and they know that they can't be them really, because another thing that the Hearing Things people and those types of like new age publications that are worker founded or co-ops or whatever, what they have over Pitchfork is they will talk about where your money's going, and Pitchfork will not, because the money's just going to Condé Nast, and it's like, why are they running a subscription for that? And so they're not going to get any goodwill on that side either. So I mean, I think this is a CNN Plus level or like a Quibi level issue here. Like, does this not speak to what people predicted was going to happen a year or two ago? Does it not speak to what will inevitably be a demise of Pitchfork? Even though it didn't happen then, trying to launch something like this really foretells of it happening sooner. Totally.
Yeah, because I think you and I were both a little bit skeptical of the reports of Pitchfork's demise when this all went down. I think there was like the Condé Nast stuff, and there was layoffs and some changes to the Pitchfork structure. We're like, it's fine. They're going to keep doing reviews, and like if they keep doing that, people will keep reading it. And
just like I was skeptical of Bandcamp Daily's demise or Bandcamp's demise at all. Yeah, same deal.
Totally. And yet now with the Pitchfork thing, we're seeing like, okay, something is up, and Pitchfork might not be long for this world. Interesting to see. And this might be the year I subscribe to Hearing Things. I keep reading the free stuff and have not clicked the button, but I think I have to clean up 1 subscription before I do that. So that'll be my thing this week.
Well, be careful then, because my recommendation is going to involve something that even for a temporary period of time, you would have to subscribe to consume.
Okay, hit me.
So, I mean, if I told you, who is Will Chernoff's favorite artist of all time? Who is it?
Is it Bill Frisell?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Then I would say there's a very short list of people underneath that, and one of them has always been Lucinda Williams.
Oh, interesting.
And so for Lucinda Williams, the rock songwriter who is associated with alt country and Americana and 80s even pop country, different things, southern sounds and blues, and a tremendous artist who you would associate with like Steve Earle, especially in the same era, but also like Bob Dylan. When I think of that's the kind of tradition that she falls in, for anybody who hasn't listened to her music. There is a rock critic, Stephen Hayden. He is known as the host of the former podcast IndieCast, and for a lot of his music writing over the years. He has a Substack called Evil Speakers, and this year, when he was faced with the question of, well, what am I going to do for subscriber-only content on my Substack? One of the things that he launched for his subscribers was a series called Catalog Club, which is a podcast series where he would talk about, he would spend a month week by week doing multiple episodes on consecutive albums in an artist catalog. And so he went through the classic period of Lucinda Williams, which spans 4 albums. Really, it spans 3 albums from 1988 to 1998, but he also talks about an album before the first one of those 3. And these are all albums that I know really well. And when I saw that he was doing this, I was like, I absolutely want to check this out, because I want to see how he approached this, because it's very much in line with like what I aspire to do. And I found it really engaging, especially because I love Lucinda Williams. I knew the music super well. To be honest, I'm probably not going to stay subscribed for his future Catalog Club iterations because I won't know all the artists as well. But the fact that he chose Lucinda Williams to open this content lane, I was really enthralled by that. And I actually, I took out of the VPL the Lucinda Williams autobiography.
Oh, wow, cool.
Which I have not read, and he references, and I'm excited to read that too. So that's kind of a sidecar recommendation as well. But my main recommendation would just be his Catalog Club series on his Substack because of that.
This is not my recommendation, but I have a tangential one to yours, which is, have you heard of the podcast Cocaine and Rhinestones?
No.
This was, I don't know if it's still going, but Cocaine and Rhinestones is stories, true stories, basically just biography style of kind of mid 20th century country music. Mid and late 20th century country music, told by this guy who is the son of a kind of not a super famous, but a working famous-ish country artist who has told many of these stories firsthand, either because his dad knew these people or whatever. And it's really well researched, and it's, I would say, at times a tiny bit dry. Like he's kind of like just a historian. He's just going through like, here's what happened. But it's laid out, and there's a good Lucinda Williams episode. So worth checking that out if you're into that kind of era of like alt country, and just everyone in that whole world they're characters. And that was that first season of the show really outlined that. I believe the second season is way more in the weeds, and that it lost me a little bit. But the first season, he's going for high interest, low detail.
Okay, yeah, I haven't heard about that. I'm curious about that. I would say for the Stephen Hayden Catalog Club at Evil Speakers, the podcast episodes that he produced for this, ends up being maybe about 30 minutes each or 30, 40 each. And it is not, I would say it's not into the weeds. He's talking about, like he read the book in preparation for it, clearly, that Lucinda's autobiography. And he's putting the albums at where they were in her life, but I guess because he has been a rock critic since the 90s, what he's talking about is what was the musical context commercially and in the industry, like what other artists were Lucinda compared to, and in what ways did she kind of shine above those kind of artists? In what ways did her music end up sounding like that time? In what ways did she reach beyond that time? It was a cool kind of tenor of the discussion. Yeah.
Very cool. My actual recommendation this week is I'm going to go broad. I'm going to say the novels of Richard Powers, who actually gifted you one of his books that I enjoyed greatly, called The Echo Maker. That's the one I gave you, right?
I've got the books on hand here, nice. So we've got 2 books on screen. There's another one. Yeah,
sweet. I read The Echo Maker. I really loved it. Bewilderment is another one I really loved. The one I'm reading right now is called Playground. To my knowledge, all of Richard Powers' novels they're not interconnected in any series, or they're not set in the same world or anything. They often have some blend of, it's not science fiction, they're just fiction, but they're often about science generally. His most famous, I believe, Pulitzer Prize winning The Overstory, which is a story, I believe, that's told from the perspective of a forest of trees. I have not read that one, but apparently very good. So there's usually a science angle, a biology angle. Orfeo is a really cool story about a composer who gets into some trouble by starting to learn like microbiology and maybe accidentally creating a bioweapon in his garage. And great book, weird book. His prose is really nice. I really like The Echo Maker as well, the one I gifted you. So people should read Richard Powers.
Okay, well, I look forward to perhaps seeing you out there between now and next time. But in case I don't, because you'll be doing some things, I hope you have a good time out there, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk soon.